Clowney, the man who made Dallas's life miserable from the inside, just showed up on Washington's radar. Sports Illustrated dropped him as an ideal landing spot for the Commanders today, and in a minute I'm gonna break down exactly why the fit makes sense, but also the reason Adam Peters shouldn't be rushing to the phone right now. Because while Ashburn's pass rush is still looking for that last piece, Jaden Daniels came out and spoke directly on Brandon AIYUK and Stefon Diggs. What he said publicly is gonna catch you off guard, but what his answer actually reveals about how this quarterback thinks, that's bigger than any free agent name, and we're getting into that right now. And we close with Frankie LUVU. The man who earned second team All-Pro honors in 24 is coming into 26 on the final year of his deal, with Durante Jones singing his praises, but a first-round rookie taking his snaps one by one. Free Frankie, everybody's saying. But the real talk is that LUVU's path this year is narrower than anyone in the DMV wants to admit, and if he doesn't execute perfectly in his new role, this could be his last season in burgundy and gold. Raise hail. Before anyone in the comments hits me with, but he's old. Stop what you're doing and listen for a second. Sports Illustrated's Carl Rasmussen published today that the Washington Commanders are one of the top 2 landing spots for Jadeveon Clowney. When a beat reporter at SI specifically names you the ideal destination for a specific player, there's usually something real underneath that. Here's the context. Clowney is 33, number 1 overall pick in 2014. 3 straight Pro Bowls in Houston, 2016 through 2018, second team All-Pro in 2016, and from 2019 on, his career turned into a 6-team tour over 7 seasons. Seattle, Tennessee, Cleveland, Baltimore, Carolina, Dallas. He's a journeyman. Everybody knows this, but here's the part that actually matters. Clowney led the Cowboys in sacks last season with 8.5 in 13 games. With 4 passes defended and a forced fumble in 13 games, man. That is not a system player. That is a pass rusher who knows exactly what to do when he's got space to operate. And he did it for one of our division rivals against our defense in a season where we needed every edge we could get. The real question isn't whether Clowney can produce. The question is whether the Commanders need him and whether the price makes sense. Let's look at Washington's current edge depth, because I think a lot of people are still picturing last year's roster and haven't updated. The Commanders signed Odafe Oweh in free agency to a 4-year, $100 million deal with $68 million guaranteed. That was their biggest defensive investment of the entire offseason. Oweh comes in at 27 years old with explosive upside and with a motor that Quinn and his staff clearly identified as central to the 2026 defense. They also signed K'Lavon Chaisson on an $11 million 1-year deal, and in the draft they took Joshua Josephs in round 5. The gap that exists is specific. Von Miller led Washington with 9 sacks last season while only playing 37% of defensive snaps, then left in free agency. That rotational sack production isn't replaced 1 for 1 by anything they've brought in. Oweh has the ability, but he's coming off a split season between Baltimore and LA, where his production was inconsistent. Chaisson is complementary. Josephs is future potential, not a September solution. That's exactly where Clowney fits. SpotRack projects his market value at $5.7 million on a 1-year deal. For a player who gave you 8.5 sacks in 13 games, that is one of the best available values in the pass rush market right now. Miller cost $6 million and produced 9 sacks playing rotation. The precedent is right there. But there's a counter argument that's also valid, and I'm not going to ignore it. Peters' offseason philosophy has been deliberately focused on getting younger on the edge. Oweh is 27. Josephs is a rookie. If you bring Clowney in at 33, you're mixing signals on your roster building direction. It's not fatal, but it's a real tension. The key tactical question is what Durante Jones does with Clowney in his scheme. Jones has talked publicly about matchability as a core concept for his linebackers. Clowney is not a traditional linebacker, he's a pure edge rusher. His best contribution in this scheme would be as a rotational pass rush specialist, 20 to 25 snaps per game, but in those specific 3rd and long situations, he's out there making quarterbacks nervous. That's exactly what Miller was in Washington. He wasn't a 70 snap guy. He was the situational weapon. Look, I could be wrong, but if Washington signs him for $5 million and Clowney gives them 6 or 7 sacks in a rotational role while Oweh establishes himself as the starter, that is extraordinary value. The question I'd ask Adam Peters directly is this: are you willing to pay for insurance in the pass rush, or do you trust that Oweh and Chaisson are enough? Because if Oweh starts slow in September and Chason doesn't produce, Quinn's defense is going to need someone who already knows how to do this. CLOWNEY at this stage still knows how to do it. One thing nobody is saying about CLOWNEY that I will say directly: availability is a real concern. He's missed time to injury in 6 of the last 7 seasons. $5.7 million on a 1-year deal makes sense precisely because the risk is contained. If he goes down in week 4, you absorb that cost in a roster with a $200 million cap. That's manageable. My honest take, this signing makes more sense in July or August than right now. Washington is in minicamp evaluating their own guys. If training camp comes and Oweh doesn't look like the dominant pass rusher you need and Chason doesn't convince, you go to the market and sign CLOWNEY. By that point, he probably takes $4 million because he's still out there. Timing matters. Peters is not a GM who makes decisions based on media pressure. He makes decisions when the roster tells him what it needs. And this roster hasn't spoken clearly yet. Now, while the defensive front is still figuring itself out, there's an offensive conversation that's been generating noise all across the DMV for weeks. And today, Jaden Daniels stepped up and spoke directly about it. Before we break down his words, I need y'all to understand something. Most 22 or 23-year-old quarterbacks in this league, when you ask them if they want more weapons in the receiver room, they say yes and quietly lobby the front office for upgrades. That's normal. That's what 90% of young quarterbacks do. Jaden Daniels did not do that. And that tells me something. John Kame of ESPN reported today that Daniels was direct and calm about the AIYUK and Diggs situation. He is excited about the receivers Washington currently has in the room. He's not waiting on anyone from outside. He's not sending smoke signals to the front office through the press. He said, and I quote, "I'm excited with the guys we have in the room." That alone is a character statement. But let's be honest about the receiver situation, because there is a real gap between what's there right now and what Washington had last season. Terry McLaurin remains the unquestioned WR1, period. McLaurin came into 2025 with 5 straight 1,000-yard seasons. His route running is among the cleanest in the league. His acceleration and tight spacing makes defensive coordinators nervous, and his chemistry with Daniels going into year 2 together should only grow. That side of the equation is solid. The problem is everything else in the room. Deebo Samuel led the team with 727 yards and 5 touchdowns last season, but Deebo is currently a free agent. If he doesn't come back, and that's the most likely outcome given the cap situation, Washington loses its second most productive offensive option from last year. No other Commanders receiver topped 300 yards. Nobody. What's there now? They're betting on Antonio Williams, their 3rd-round pick out of Clemson, to take on a meaningful role. Treylon Burks, Dynami Brown. Honestly, that's a room with real question marks. Not a bad room necessarily, but one where the depth depends on players who still have to prove they can hold up in a playoff caliber offense. That's exactly where the AIYUK and Diggs conversation becomes real. Start with AIYUK because the drama out in San Francisco is what's driving all of this. AIYUK went on social media and called the 49ers dumb for paying him $50 million in guarantees over 8 months and then voiding his 2027 guarantees. He clearly wants out. And when he's healthy, his talent is undeniable, but I'm gonna push back on the narrative that Washington should go all in on AIYUK. And it's not just because of the Instagram stuff. The strongest argument against bringing AIYUK to Washington has nothing to do with his talent. It has everything to do with who the Commanders are right now. This organization under Josh Harris and Adam Peters has spent 2 years rebuilding something that goes way beyond talent. The culture, the credibility, the sense of stability that makes players want to be here. That is not cosmetic, it's structural. The most powerful asset in Ashburn right now is not the talent on the roster, it's the environment that Quinn has built. A locker room where accountability is real. Bringing in a receiver whose pattern of behavior, when he has a grievance, is to take it public on social media. That's a variable you can't control. Not because he's a bad person, but because a locker room that Quinn is cultivating carefully does not need that kind of friction. On top of that, AIYUK is coming off a serious knee injury. Washington doesn't need to bet a meaningful draft asset, which is what San Francisco would ask for. Plus deal with a contract structure that has voided guarantees, all on a player showing simultaneous red flags medically and characterially. With Diggs, the conversation is different. More experience, more documented professionalism. Doesn't carry the same pattern of public drama. The concern there is age and recent production. At 32, with his injury history over the last year and a half, the question is whether he can still be the differential WR2 Washington would actually need him to be. My read on Washington's receiver situation is this: if the right deal shows up at the right price, without compromising the character of the locker room, Peters should move on it. But if that exact deal doesn't appear, Daniels already said he's good, and I believe him because this quarterback has something quarterbacks of his generation rarely have in year 2, the ability to do something with whatever's in front of him. The uncomfortable question nobody answers honestly is whether this receiver group is good enough to compete deep into the NFC playoffs. I have real doubts there. The Eagles have proven depth, so do the Lions, but there's time between now and the October trade deadline to make that call with more information. That kind of strategic patience is the Adam Peters signature. And speaking of decisions that are going to get made on the field and not in June, there's a linebacker who this season has everything to gain and everything to lose at the same time. Free Frankie. That's what Locked On DC is saying this week. They're right. But the story is more complicated and more interesting than those two words. Frankie LUVU enters 2026 in the final year of his 3-year, $30 million contract that he signed with Washington coming into 2024. And in those 2 years, his numbers tell two completely different stories that you have to put next to each other to understand what's actually happening. 2024, 8 sacks, 99 total tackles, 14 QB hits. 12 tackles for loss, 7 passes defended, 1 interception, 2 fumble recoveries, second team All-Pro, started every single game. That Frankie LUVU was one of the most dangerous linebackers in the entire NFC. 2025, sacks fall to 3, total pressures down to 25, total tackles drop to 86, his lowest output since his first season in Carolina back in 2021. The easy story is that LUVU declined. The correct story is understanding why he dropped off and whether the 2026 setup gives him the conditions to be the 2024 version again. 2 real factors caused the drop. First, Washington's defense last season was a structural disaster. The defensive line was constantly banged up, which forced the linebackers to fight double teams directly instead of pursuing plays in open space. That kills the stats of a linebacker whose best football happens in space. Second, the previous defensive coordinator pulled LUVU out of almost every pass rush package, dropping him into zone coverage where he is not his best self. And that's where Durante Jones coming in as the new defensive coordinator changes the entire calculation. Jones said publicly he loves Frankie LUVU. He had tape of LUVU in his meeting room before he ever got to Washington, using him as an example of a linebacker with the matchability qualities his scheme demands. He said specifically that LUVU is best going downhill, attacking the quarterback, and winning matchups against running backs. That last part, matchups against running backs, what is the central concept of the Jones system? Linebackers aren't just run stoppers or generic blitzers, they're matchup weapons. They follow backs into coverage and blitz cleanly in 3rd and long. That is exactly what LUVU was doing in 2024. The conditions of 2025 just stopped him from showing it. Now, here's the complicated part, the part the Free Frankie headline doesn't capture. LUVU enters 2026 with internal pressure he didn't have in either of his 2 previous seasons here. Washington using the 7th overall pick on Sonny Styles is the clearest possible signal. Styles can do everything LUVU does with more range and coverage. Styles is going to be the starting Mike linebacker from day 1. That is not a debate, it's just reality. LUVU is also not a pure will, because his open field coverage against wide receivers is not his strength, and the Sam role in the Jones scheme will likely go to Leo Chenal or Kelvin Chaisson, who fit the physical alignment requirements on the edge better. So the real question nobody is answering honestly: how many meaningful snaps is Frankie LUVU actually going to see in 2026? My read is that his role becomes a hybrid rush linebacker who plays in specific packages, not 70 snaps a game, probably 40 to 50 in selected situations where Jones frees him against the backfield, sends him as a blitzer on 3rd down, or uses him in linebacker DE matchup packages on 2 tight end sets. In that defined role, with a healthier defensive front around him, Javon Kinlaw plus Owe and Chaisson, LUVU could get back to his 2024 pressure and sack numbers simply because the conditions around him are better. But the contract pressure is real and it colors everything. It's the final year of his deal and he turns 30 in September. If Washington doesn't extend him before the season, odds and ESPN's John Keem noted an extension was more likely a year ago than now. Every game in 2026 becomes an audition for the 2027 free agent market. That can be enormous fuel or a distraction. It depends on the player's character, and LUVU, from everything we know publicly, is exactly the kind of professional who uses that pressure as fuel rather than an excuse. I'm saying free Frankie. But the Frankie who gets freed in 2026 doesn't have the same path as the All-Pro Frankie from 2024. It's narrower, more specific, less margin for error. If Jones deploys him well, and if LUVU has the discipline to be the best at his defined role rather than trying to be everything, this could be the year he earns his next big contract. If not, this could be his last year as a Commander. That's everything I've got today, fam. And look, all 3 topics today actually tell one story. Washington is in refinement mode. They're not panicking. They're not making desperate moves. A CLOWNEY signing at $5 or $6 million if the roster calls for it. A disciplined pass on AIYUK if the price or the character don't fit. A Frankie LUVU who has to earn his future in Jones's scheme. That is a front office that knows exactly what it's building. And that kind of clarity from an organization that had absolutely none of it for decades, man. That still makes me feel like we're heading somewhere real. Raise hail, always. If this video gave you something, hit the like, subscribe, and drop your take in the comments. Should Washington sign CLOWNEY, or do you trust Away and Chasson to get it done? I want to read every single one.